Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is World War I, Stateside Service. The year is 1915, and Eisenhower has just graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's been commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army, and his first assignment was at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Now, much of the rest of the world, certainly Europe, at war. World War I is underway, but U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had kept the Americans out of the war, neutral, at least so far. So for Eisenhower, in his first job in the Army, relatively light duty at Fort Sam Houston. In fact, he had a little extra time on his hands, and the commanding general, Fred Funston, had a favor. Could he coach some football like he had done at West Point at one of the local schools, the Peacock Military Academy? And Eisenhower immediately said, for the boss, sure thing. Well, a couple of months in at Fort Sam Houston, Eisenhower was introduced to a 19-year-old woman by the name of Mamie Doud. Now, Mamie Doud's father, John, had retired early. He was quite wealthy. They lived in a 6-bedroom mansion in Denver primarily, but they spent their winters in San Antonio, and she was on base this particular day, introduced to Eisenhower. In fact, he invited her to go on a walk. He was officer of the day, took her a little bit around the base. He was pretty much smitten from the very beginning. He wrote that the one who attracted my eye instantly was a vivacious and attractive girl, smaller than average, saucy in the look about her face and in her whole attitude. As for Mamie, what did she say? She called Ike just about the handsomest male I had ever seen. But it was Mamie that was actually the hot prospect, coming again from a wealthy family. Her social calendar was absolutely jam-packed, occasional dates with Eisenhower, but with others as well. Look, he was undeterred. When he wasn't courting her, he was courting the family. Even if she had a date that night, he would go over to the house, spend some time with the family. He'd be there when she got home. They got close pretty fast. In fact, after just a couple of months, it was Valentine's Day of 1916 when Eisenhower proposed marriage, and Mamie said yes. He gave her his class ring. Now, Mamie's parents really liked Eisenhower, and he really liked them, but they were still thinking these kids are a little bit too young. Maybe wait for about a year to get married, but circumstances would be so that they actually wouldn't make it the full year that they thought they would, because while war was going on in Europe, the United States actually had a military challenge with Mexico, much closer to home. Mexico, very unstable right now. Different groups were jockeying for position, and the loser seemed to be Pancho Villa and his followers. And he blamed the Americans, in part for him not securing power in Mexico. So what did he do? He took a bunch of marauders across the border into Columbus, New Mexico, and slaughtered 17 Americans before hightailing it back across the border into Mexico. Well, the Americans were outraged across the country about this. President Wilson ordered General John Pershing to go into Mexico and try to capture Pancho Villa. Now, Eisenhower assumed, he's based in San Antonio, he's part of the infantry, that he is going to be assigned to this, but he wanted to get married. So rather than get stuck in Mexico for months as a bachelor, he actually sought permission to get married first. The problem was all leaves had been canceled because of the circumstances with Mexico. The only one who could approve an emergency leave was the commanding general himself, General Funston. So Eisenhower, after being told no at lower levels to go off and get married and have leave, he went to see the general himself, and fortunately Funston remembered that Ike had done him a favor. When he had coached football, or a little bit before, he said, okay, I'll give you 10 days, emergency leave, go off and get married. So they immediately went off to Denver. Mamie and Dwight Eisenhower getting married at the Doud home in Denver. They took a couple of days to go to El Dorado Hills nearby for a honeymoon. Then it was off to Abilene, Kansas to meet Ike's parents. And this was an eye-opener for Mamie Doud. She had never seen sort of such squalor, such poverty, that Ike had grown up in the family home there. Things actually weren't a lot better for her when they got to the family quarters in the base in San Antonio. They were nothing like what she was used to. She was used to servants and very fine things. It was not the accommodation she got. She didn't know how to cook. Mostly they ate on base. Quite a few adjustments going on. Now, Ike was still ready to deploy to Mexico, but the fact is that mission was canceled. They did not catch Pancho Villa. The mission did not prove fruit, but President Wilson eventually decided, you know what, we got to concentrate on what's going on here. And he was concentrating on his election. He was running to, again, keep the United States out of war, going up against the Republican Charles Evans Hughes, a very close race. It came down to California, 3,000 votes were the difference, and Wilson won. So it looked like the U.S. would stay out of World War I. But then the Germans changed the calculus because they adopted a model of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, all of a sudden, neutral vessels, commercial ships, including American ships, were going to be in peril. In fact, some were starting to be sunk by German submarines. So that was enough for Wilson. He went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war on April the 2nd of 1917. It was granted. But what would this mean now for Dwight Eisenhower? There was a massive mobilization underway, a draft to get most of the people who were going to do the fighting. The current officers were all promoted. Now, Ike had recently been promoted already to a first lieutenant. Now we got a temporary promotion to captain, and he was named the regimental supply officer, which was a huge job in terms of the mobilization. Frankly, they were making up a lot of it as they went along, but he was hardworking. He got stuff done, actually very, very successful in this particular role. There was only one person who was unhappy, and that was Mamie. She was wondering, what's going on here? We just got married. She said, you're not going to leave me here so soon after our wedding day, as he was spending most of his time about 25 miles away. And Ike said, look, here's the deal. My country comes first and always will. You come second. Again, adjustments being made between Ike and Mamie early here in their marriage. Now, for Eisenhower, what did he want to do? He wanted to lead troops in battle like most of his fellow West Point graduates, but the fact is he was really good at some other stuff as an organizer, an administrator, an instructor. So the Army had different things in mind for Ike. He sent him to Oglethorpe, Georgia to train newly drafted non-commissioned officers to prepare to go overseas. While this was going on, he went east. Mamie actually went west to give birth to their first son they named Doud, although they always called Icky. As for Eisenhower, from Oglethorpe, Georgia to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for more training, and then he was off to Fort Meade in Maryland. This is now February of 1918. Well, again, American soldiers are being sent overseas. He is still at home at the first tank school ever in the United States. People really excited about this new capability, this new technology, this new weapon of war. Eisenhower said the men dreamed of overwhelming assault on enemy lines, rolling effortlessly over wire entanglements and trenches, demolishing gun nests with their fire and terrorizing the foe into quick and abject surrender. Well, that was the vision, and I caught the attention of the commander there of the tank school, of Colonel by the name of Ira Welborn. He thought Ike was very impressive, so he said, you know what? I'm going to send you off to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to stand up our new armored division. Camp Colt was the name of the camp. He was the only regular officer that was being assigned to Camp Colt. Now, as the commander, he was temporarily promoted to the rank of major, so he'd have maybe a little bit more authority. 10,000 soldiers on their way to Camp Colt. 600 newly minted drafted officers are coming as well for a complete startup operation. They had nothing in place at Camp Colt, including no tanks. The American manufacturers had yet to sort of figure out how to create a tank. They're trying to do this as fast as they could. So in the meantime, Ike, as the soldiers were coming along, put machine guns actually in the back of flatbed trucks, doing the best he could to sort of simulate what a tank might look like and behave like when it came to combat. During the summer of 1918, a couple of French Renault tanks finally made its way over to Camp Colt, and this is what Ike now used to do most of the training. The biggest enemy that Eisenhower had to deal with weren't the Germans overseas, it was the Spanish flu, the global pandemic that eventually took about 50 million lives around the world, including 675,000 Americans, came to Camp Colt. And for Eisenhower, he caught it pretty quickly as the commander. He immediately started to isolate people who were showing symptoms. Yes, 175 soldiers died at Camp Colt from the Spanish flu, but that was actually considered a success compared to most of the Army bases. The Army brass actually sent some folks to talk to Ike to see how he had limited the damage so much so that they could potentially replicate that elsewhere. Ike was pretty popular with the men under his command. One of them said this: he knows his job, is enthusiastic, can tell us what he wants to do, and is pretty human, though wickedly harsh and abrupt. You didn't want to get on his bad side. He had high expectations, but also that sense of optimism that kept encouraging his men in terms of their training. But mostly what Eisenhower wanted was to lead troops in combat. The troops were deploying. His officers that he was training were deploying, but he was not, and he was frustrated. Finally, it's October now of 1918. He finally gets his orders. He's going to France. He's going to command an armored regiment. In fact, they're getting ready for a spring offensive, so he's going to go over in the middle of November. Had a kind of a tearful goodbye with Mamie on November the 10th. She then headed home. And then the next day, armistice happened. And so Ike would not be going overseas because the war came to an end. Most everybody's celebrating. For Eisenhower, he was actually depressed. He told a friend that I suppose we'll spend the rest of our lives explaining why we didn't get into this war. Now, Eisenhower stayed home, stateside during the entire war, but he still made a very positive impression on the military commanders, particularly Colonel Welborn, who actually worked behind the scenes to get him the Distinguished Service Medal. It took a couple of years. Not many people who didn't deploy actually got this medal, so Ike was pretty proud of it. But the demobilization now is already underway. What's next for Dwight Eisenhower? Would he even stay in the Army? Well, those are stories for another day. That's Dwight Eisenhower and World War I stateside service. From the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.